handcuffs were too tight. That was the first thing Nicolás Maduro noticed as they led him through the underground tunnel connecting the Metropolitan Detention Center to the Federal Courthouse in Lower Manhattan. Not painful exactly, but restrictive in a way that was clearly intentional. A reminder with every small movement that he was no longer a president, no longer a leader, no longer anything except defendant number 2026, CR 00847 in the Southern District of New York. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with an electrical buzz that seemed to match the anxiety coursing through his veins. Behind him, Celia walked in her own restraints, flanked by federal marshals who maintained professional distance but watchful eyes. They hadn't been allowed to speak to each other since boarding the helicopter in Caracas 5 days ago. Every interaction had been monitored, recorded, controlled. Even now, walking just feet apart, they might as well have been on different continents. The elevator ride up to the courtroom level was silent except for the mechanical grinding of cables and pulleys. Maduro caught his reflection in the polished steel doors. The orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame. He'd lost weight during the 5 days of detention, stress and institutional food combining to strip away the carefully maintained image of robust leadership he'd projected for years. His hair, usually styled with precision, was disheveled. Dark circles under his eyes spoke to sleepless nights on a thin mattress, staring at a concrete ceiling, contemplating how quickly everything had collapsed. The courtroom doors opened, and Maduro was immediately struck by how different it was from what he'd imagined. He'd pictured something grand, theatrical, like the courtrooms in American movies. Instead, it was austere, functional, designed to minimize drama and maximize efficiency. Wooden benches for spectators, already packed with journalists whose faces betrayed eager anticipation of witnessing history. A judge's bench elevated above the floor, empty for now but looming like a throne of judgment. And there, at the prosecution table, 3 lawyers in dark suits reviewing documents with the focused intensity of surgeons preparing for a complex operation. Maduro's own attorney, Marcus Richardson, was already seated at the defense table. Richardson was a legendary criminal defense lawyer, someone who'd represented cartel leaders, corrupt politicians, and international fugitives. He'd been hired by what remained of Maduro's legal team in Venezuela, paid with funds that would probably be seized eventually, but for now could still purchase the best defense money could buy. Richardson stood as Maduro approached, his expression professionally neutral but his eyes conveying concern. "Mr. Maduro," he said quietly, as the marshals removed the handcuffs and guided Maduro into the chair beside him. "We need to talk quickly before the judge arrives. The prosecution filed supplemental evidence last night. They have recordings." "What kind of recordings?" Maduro kept his voice low, aware that every word in this room might be monitored. "Audio intercepts, allegedly from your private communications over the past 20 years. Phone calls, meetings, conversations with individuals they claim are drug cartel leaders. Mr. Maduro, if these recordings are authentic and admissible, they're devastating." Before Maduro could respond, the bailiff's voice cut through the courtroom chatter. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Sarah Mitchell presiding. Everyone stood as Judge Mitchell entered. A woman in her early 60s with gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that suggested she'd seen every trick, every manipulation, every desperate defense strategy that lawyers could devise. She'd been a federal prosecutor for 15 years before being appointed to the bench, and her reputation was that of someone who valued efficiency and had little patience for theatrics. "Please be seated," she said, settling into her chair and immediately beginning to review documents on her desk. "We're here for the arraignment, an initial plea in United States v. Nicolás Maduro Guerra and Celia Flores. Let the record show both defendants are present with counsel. Prosecution, please state your appearance." The lead prosecutor stood, a tall woman with sharp features and an air of absolute confidence. "Assistant United States Attorney Jennifer Hartwick for the government, Your Honor. With me are AUSA Michael Chen and AUSA Rebecca Santos. Defense, Marcus Richardson, for Defendant Nicolás Maduro, Your Honor. Patricia Delgado, for defendant Cilia Flores, Your Honor. Judge Mitchell nodded, making a note. Very well. Before we proceed with the formal arraignment, I understand the government has filed supplemental evidence. Miss Hartwick, would you like to address this? Hartwick stood again, and Maduro felt his stomach tighten. This was it. Whatever bomb they were about to drop, it was coming now. Your Honor. Yes. Last night the government filed notice of additional evidence obtained through lawful intercepts conducted by the Drug Enforcement Administration and other federal agencies over the past 2 decades. This evidence includes audio recordings of conversations between defendant Maduro and various individuals identified as leaders of drug trafficking organizations, specifically conversations relating to the protection of cocaine shipments, financial arrangements for narcotics operations, and coordination with what is known as the Cartel of the Suns within the Venezuelan military. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Journalists were already typing on phones and laptops. Richardson leaned close to Maduro. Did you know about any recordings? There were always rumors of American surveillance. Maduro whispered back. But 20 years? That's impossible. We had security protocols, encrypted communications. Clearly they weren't enough, Richardson muttered. Judge Mitchell banged her gavel twice. Order, Miss Hartwick. Are you planning to present any of these recordings today? Your Honor, given the significance of this evidence to the government's case, we believe it's appropriate to play a brief selection for the court during these proceedings. It goes directly to the question of bail and flight risk. Richardson shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. An arraignment is not the appropriate time for evidence presentation. The government is trying to prejudice these proceedings before we've even entered a plea. Your Honor, Hartwick countered smoothly. The defendant is a former head of state accused of using his official position to facilitate narco-terrorism. The court needs to understand the full scope of the charges when considering bail. These recordings are not just evidence of crimes. They're evidence of ongoing criminal enterprise at the highest levels of a foreign government. Judge Mitchell considered this for a moment, her fingers drumming on the bench. I'll allow a limited presentation, no more than 5 minutes of recordings. But Miss Hartwick, this better be directly relevant to bail considerations, or I'll strike it from the record, and we'll have a serious discussion about prosecutorial overreach. Understood, Your Honor. Hartwick nodded to a USA Chen, who stood and approached a laptop connected to the courtroom's audio system. Maduro felt sweat beginning to form on his palms. 20 years of surveillance. How much did they actually have? And more importantly, what would they choose to play in this public courtroom in front of cameras and journalists who would broadcast every word to the world? The first recording crackled to life through the speakers. The audio quality was surprisingly clear, obviously enhanced by technical experts. And there, unmistakably, was Maduro's own voice, younger but recognizable, speaking Spanish, that was immediately translated by a court interpreter. The shipment from Colombia needs to move through a pure state. I've spoken with General Rodriguez. He'll ensure border patrols are reassigned for 72 hours. Your people can move freely during that window. Another voice responded, rougher, with an accent that suggested someone from Colombia's rural regions. And the payment? Half now, half when the shipment reaches Maracaibo. $30 million, as we discussed. 20 for operational costs. 10 for political security. The date stamp on the recording March 2015. Maduro had been president for 2 years at that point. The courtroom was absolutely silent, except for the voices emanating from the speakers. Maduro felt his heart racing. He remembered that conversation, remembered the calculation behind it. At the time, Venezuela was already facing economic pressure from falling oil prices. The narcotics revenue had seemed like a necessary evil, a way to maintain government operations while American sanctions squeezed traditional funding sources. But hearing it played back now, in this context, stripped of all political justification and geopolitical complexity, it sounded exactly like what the Americans were claiming it was. Criminal conspiracy, narco-terrorism. The recording ended, and immediately another began. This one was from 2018, during the height of Venezuela's economic collapse. The Americans are increasing surveillance on our Caribbean routes. We need to diversify. Maduro's voice again, speaking to someone whose identity was identified on screen as Miguel Angel El Gordo Carrillo, a known leader of the Sinaloa cartel. There are Pacific options, through Nicaragua, then up through Central America. It adds time but reduces exposure. What about your border situation? I'm hearing reports of military checkpoints that aren't on our agreed routes. There's been some confusion at the operational level. I'll address it directly. General Padrino will ensure compliance. You have my word. Your word, Mr. President, is worth 30 tons a month to us. I hope it remains valuable. It will. Venezuela needs the relationship as much as you do. The recording clicked off. 5 recordings total, spanning from 2009 to 2024. Each one more damaging than the last. Maduro discussing shipment routes, payment arrangements, military protection for narcotics operations. His voice, his words, his unmistakable involvement in exactly what the indictment charged him with. By the time the final recording ended, Maduro felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath him. He'd known the Americans had intelligence, but this was different. This wasn't hearsay or informant testimony that could be challenged. This was his own voice, preserved digitally, authenticated by experts. Irrefutable evidence of everything they'd accused him of. Richardson's face had gone pale. Even a lawyer of his experience could recognize a devastating evidentiary advantage. Beside Maduro, Cilia sat frozen, her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to look at him or anyone else in the courtroom. Judge Mitchell let the silence hang for a moment before speaking. Miss Hartwick, I assume you have chain of custody documentation and technical authentication for these recordings? Yes, Your Honor. All filed with our supplemental evidence brief. DEA surveillance conducted under proper FISA warrants, technical analysis by FBI audio forensics, translation verification by certified linguists. Every piece has been meticulously documented. Mr. Richardson, obviously you'll want to review all of this before trial, and you'll have full opportunity to challenge admissibility. But for purposes of this proceeding, I've heard enough to understand the government's bail position. Let's proceed with the arraignment. The formal reading of charges took 15 minutes. Narco-terrorism conspiracy, international drug trafficking, money laundering, use of official position to facilitate criminal enterprise. 8 separate counts, each carrying decades of potential prison time. When Judge Mitchell finally asked for Maduro's plea, he stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom. How does the defendant plead? Not guilty. His voice was steady, though everything inside him felt like it was collapsing. Not guilty to all charges. Let the record reflect defendant Maduro's plea of not guilty. Miss Flores, Cilia stood as well, her voice barely audible. Not guilty. Very well. Now regarding bail. Miss Hartwick. The prosecutor stood with the confidence of someone who knew they held every advantage. Your Honor, the government requests remand without bail for both defendants. Mr. Maduro is an extreme flight risk. He has access to significant financial resources hidden in offshore accounts. He has diplomatic connections with multiple countries including Russia, China, Cuba, and Iran, any of which might offer him sanctuary. He has demonstrated willingness to use military force and criminal networks to achieve his objectives. And as the recordings demonstrate, he has spent decades building relationships with international criminal organizations who would be highly motivated to facilitate his escape. Furthermore, Your Honor, these defendants pose a danger to the community. Mr. Maduro controlled military and intelligence assets that conducted operations against American interests. Even in custody, he potentially has the ability to order attacks or intimidate witnesses. The government has already received credible threats against potential witnesses in this case. Threats we believe originate from individuals still loyal to the defendants. Richardson stood to respond, but his argument sounded hollow even to Maduro's ears. Talk of due process and presumption of innocence rang meaningless, when everyone in the room had just heard audio evidence of decades of criminal conspiracy. Your Honor, my client is entitled to bail consideration regardless of the charges. Yes, he was a foreign head of state, but he's now in United States custody, subject to United States law. He has no ability to flee. He poses no danger to the community. And regarding the recordings, I remind the court that my client is presumed innocent. Those recordings, assuming they're even authentic, require context and legal interpretation that cannot be determined in an arraignment. He's not wrong about context, Maduro thought bitterly. But what context could possibly make those conversations sound less damning? Judge Mitchell reviewed her notes for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she spoke. Bail is denied. Both defendants will remain in federal custody pending trial. Given the nature of the charges and the evidence presented, I find that no conditions of release could reasonably ensure the defendant's appearance at trial or the safety of the community. Trial is set for 6 months from today, allowing both sides adequate time for discovery and motion practice. We're adjourned. The gavel came down with a sound like a gunshot. As marshals moved forward to place handcuffs back on Maduro's wrists, he caught Richardson's eye. "How bad is this?" he asked quietly. The lawyer's expression was grim. "Mr. Maduro, I've defended cases against the federal government for 30 years. I've never seen them come to court with this much evidence. The recordings alone would be devastating, but they're also claiming documentary evidence, witness testimony, financial records. They've been building this case for 2 decades, and they're not planning to offer any deals. What are my options?" Richardson glanced around to ensure no one was listening too closely. "Realistically, you have 2 choices. First, we can fight this at trial. I'll challenge every piece of evidence, attack the surveillance warrants, question the authenticity of the recordings, argue entrapment and political persecution. It's possible we could win some motions, exclude some evidence. But Mr. Maduro, I have to be honest with you. If even half of what they presented today is admissible, you're looking at conviction on multiple counts and a sentence of life in prison. And the second option? Cooperation. You provide information about the drug networks, identify other participants in the trafficking operations, help the U.S. government dismantle the organizations you worked with. In exchange, the prosecution might recommend a reduced sentence, maybe 20 years instead of life. Maybe less if your information is valuable enough. Maduro felt rage building inside him. You want me to become an informant, to betray everyone who trusted me. I want you to survive this, Mr. Maduro. The government has you dead to rights. Those recordings are just the beginning. They probably have surveillance footage, intercepted emails, bank records, witness testimony from dozens of people who've already cut their own deals. This isn't a political prosecution you can fight with rhetoric and appeals to sovereignty. This is a criminal case with overwhelming evidence, and you need to think very carefully about whether pride is worth dying in prison. The marshals were waiting. The conversation was over. As Maduro was led from the courtroom, he caught one last glimpse of the journalists frantically typing, updating websites, sending footage to news organizations around the world. By tonight, everyone would know. The recordings would be analyzed, transcribed, debated. His voice, his words, his crimes, all laid bare for global consumption. In the holding cell beneath the courthouse, waiting for transport back to the Metropolitan Detention Center, Maduro sat alone with his thoughts. Celia had been taken to a separate cell. Richardson had left to begin reviewing the thousands of pages of evidence the prosecution had dumped on the defense team. For the first time since his capture, Maduro allowed himself to truly confront what had happened. Not just the military operation in Caracas, not just the betrayal by Rafael and whoever else had sold him out, but the deeper, more fundamental failure. He'd convinced himself that the narcotics arrangements were necessary evils, that the ends of maintaining the Bolivarian revolution justified the means of partnering with criminal organizations. He'd told himself that he was protecting Venezuela from American imperialism, that the drug money was no different than oil revenue or any other commodity trade. But sitting in that cell, Listening to his own words played back in that courtroom, Maduro couldn't maintain those justifications anymore. He hadn't been a revolutionary leader making difficult choices in impossible circumstances. He'd been a criminal who happened to have the power of a state behind him, and now he was going to pay for it. The door to the cell opened. A federal marshal stood there with what looked like a tablet computer. "Maduro, you have a visitor." "Well, not a visitor exactly. Video conference call. It's been authorized by the court and will be monitored." Maduro stood, confused. "Who wants to talk to me?" "Didn't say. But apparently it's important enough that Judge Mitchell signed off on it." He was led to a small room with a desk and a large monitor. The marshal activated the system, and suddenly Maduro was looking at a face he'd seen countless times on television, but never expected to see directly. Donald Trump, sitting in what appeared to be the Oval Office, looking at the camera with an expression that mixed triumph with calculation. "Nicolás," Trump said, his voice carrying clearly through the speakers, "I hope they're treating you well. Federal prison isn't the palace, is it?" Maduro said nothing. What was there to say? "I'm calling because I want to make you an offer," Trump continued. "You heard those recordings today. That's maybe 5% of what we have. We've been watching you, recording you, documenting everything for 20 years. We know where the money is. We know who your partners were. We know everything. So why do you need me?" Maduro finally spoke. "Because there are things we don't know. Bank account numbers. Names of officials in other countries who helped facilitate your operations. Details about Chinese and Russian involvement in the drug trade through Venezuela. Information that could help us dismantle the entire network. You give us that information, you make yourself useful, and maybe we can talk about you spending 15 years in prison instead of life. Maybe you get to see freedom again before you die. And what about Cilia? That depends on you. Cooperate fully, and we'll consider reducing her charges. She's less valuable to us than you are, but we're willing to package you together if you give us what we need." Maduro stared at the screen, at the man who had orchestrated his capture and was now offering him a devil's bargain. Betray everyone he'd worked with, expose the full scope of the corruption that had sustained his government, admit to crimes that would destroy whatever remained of his legacy. In exchange for what? A shorter prison sentence. The possibility of seeing daylight again before he was too old to enjoy it. "I need to think about it," Maduro said finally. Trump shrugged. "You've got time. 6 months until trial. But Nicolás, understand something. Every day you wait, every day you hold on to pride and loyalty to people who don't give a damn about you anymore. You're choosing life in prison over a chance at some kind of future. The recordings we played today, that was the gentle introduction. Wait until you see what we present at trial. By the time we're done, you'll wish you'd taken this deal." The screen went black. The marshal led Maduro back to the holding cell, where he would wait for transport back to detention. As he sat there, reviewing everything that had happened in the courtroom, the devastating evidence, the crushing weight of his own recorded words, the impossible choice Trump had presented, Maduro finally understood something fundamental. This wasn't about politics or ideology anymore. This wasn't about American imperialism or Bolivarian resistance. This was about one man facing the consequences of 20 years of criminal decisions, sitting in a cell, contemplating whether the small dignity of silence was worth spending the rest of his life in prison. The answer would determine everything that came next.